Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from KnittingHouseSquare, and today I have another quick and easy knitting tutorial for you. So today we're going to be making one of these twist ear warmers, and what's great about this project is first up, it's knit out of bulky weight yarn, so it makes for a very quick knit. So if you're looking for a last minute gift, this may be the place to look. And the other great thing about it is it's knit flat, so we just use straight knitting needles. So we essentially just knit one long strip, and then we create the twist by seaming it at the end. So first, I'm going to go through all materials you need for this project, and then I'm going to go through each of the individual steps I used to create this. So this is beginner friendly. I show you everything that you need to be able to create this, even if you've never knit before. On my website, you're going to find the full written version of this pattern, as well as all the links to the materials I used. You'll also find each of the video breakpoints down below this video. That way, if you want to fast forward or rewind any specific part of the video, that'll be linked down below as well. Let's get started. First up for the materials, I'll go through what I knit this exact one in the video out of. So I use some bulky weight yarn that I got at Joann's. This is the 2 hands Hue plus Me in the mustard colorway. And what you're looking for to knit one similar to mine is you're looking for this bulky or number 5 logo on your yarn. So I use the exact knitting needle size recommended for bulky yarn, the 10.5 knitting needles. And these are the straight knitting needles I selected. They're 10 inches long, and again, size US 10.5 or 6.5 millimeters. Now, depending on the size you're knitting and how large you want the circumference to be, you may need more or less yarn than mine. I went with the 16-inch circumference, and so I ended up using a total of 44 yards for this pattern. The last few little supplies you'll need are a pair of scissors, and you'll want a tapestry needle. So here I have 2 examples. You can use metal or plastic. Just make sure the eye of the tapestry needle, so the opening, is big enough to thread your yarn through. And then you'll want either a stitch marker that opens and closes or a piece of yarn that's just a little scrap. This is what we're going to use to mark the front of our work so that we can keep track of the front or the back. So if you don't have a stitch marker, just take a piece of yarn instead and tie it onto the front of your work. Last up, you'll also want something to measure with, so I find those cloth tape measures are usually best. I also wanted to show you real quick another version that I knit, and this one is also out of bulky weight yarn, just this yarn was a little bit thinner than the Hue plus Me. So this yarn is Plump by Spin Cycle Yarns, and it's American wool, 100 yards, bulky weight. I ended up using exactly half of a skein of yarn for this project, so I used 50 yards for this slightly lighter worsted weight, and I'll have all the details of how I worked this one linked again on my website down below. I'm also going to include a worsted weight version linked on my website. That way, if you don't want to do something in bulky yarn, I'll give you all the instructions for how you can create the exact same look and thickness using worsted weight instead. Now for this ear warmer, you really can use any cast-on method you'd like. I'm going to show you a quick cast-on method, which is called the backward loop cast-on. So this method starts with a slip knot. So you can create the slip knot however you'd like. I'll show you how I create a slip knot. So I'm just going to take about 12 inches and drape it over my left hand. So I have the working ball further away, that yarn tail closest to me. I'm going to grab onto that strand with my bottom 3 fingers. And now I'm going to take that working yarn, go back behind, down to the bottom, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, and then back behind down to the bottom. Now I'm going to grab onto that second strand with my bottom 3 fingers as well. So I create a slip knot by rearranging these 2 loops. So I'm going to take the middle loop, bring it up closer to the top of my finger, take the new middle loop, bring it up closer to the top of my finger, and then take the newest middle loop, slide it off of my finger, and now I have a slip knot. So this slip knot, I'm going to just hold right in front of me so that I have the tail closest to me and the working yarn further away. And I'm going to take one of my knitting needle points and just slide it right into the slip knot going from the right to the left. And now gently pull on the piece of cut yarn, so the tail of the yarn, so that it snugs up on your knitting needle. You don't want it too tight. You want to still be able to move it around. So that slip knot counts as our first stitch. Now we need to cast on. I'm going to do a total of 17, so another 16 stitches. So how I continue casting on now, it looks very similar to that slip knot. I'm going to take my left hand, put it behind the working yarn, so the one attached to the ball, grab onto the strand with my bottom 3 fingers, and I'll take my pointer finger, go down below, up the front to the top, back behind down the bottom, up the front to the top. And now I'm going to take that topmost loop, slide it off of my finger and onto the knitting needle. I need to create a new loop on my finger now, so I'm going to go back behind, down the bottom, up the front to the top. And now I'm going to slide that newest top loop off of my finger onto the knitting needle. So we just keep on creating that looping motion where you go back behind, up the front to the top then, slide it off of your finger onto the knitting needle, over and over again until you have a total of, for me, 17 stitches on your knitting needle. If you ever lose your yarn and accidentally drop it, just put that left hand behind the working yarn again, grab onto it with your bottom 3 fingers, and then loop twice. So go back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up to the front to the top again. And then start sliding the loops off your finger. Okay, so I have my 17 stitches cast on, so now I'm going to turn my work. For the first row, we're just going to work a simple ribbing pattern. So this is kind of like our setup row here. We'll have 2 setup rows. So I'm going to work knit 1, purl 1, all the way across until 1 stitch remains, and then I'm going to knit the final stitch. So a quick reminder of how you work in knit 1. You're going to take your right knitting needle, which is the one that doesn't have any stitches on it currently, and you're going to go into the front base of the first loop on your left knitting needle, going from the left towards the right, front to back. Then you're going to wrap your yarn, go over towards your left hand, up over the top, down towards the right, pull it snug, and then take that right knitting needle and pull that loop through. So knit the first stitch. Then I'm going to purl a stitch. So whenever you're purling, you have to bring your yarn to the front. When your yarn is in the front, now you're going to take your right knitting needle and you're going to go into the base of the next stitch on the left knitting needle, going from the right towards the left, back to front. Wrap your yarn now up above, then down below, pull it snug, and push that loop through. So I'll show it one more time. Next up, we're knitting. So I'm going to bring my yarn to the back to knit, go into the base of the next stitch, going from left to right, front to back. Wrap your yarn up towards your left hand, then over the top, pull it snug over there on the right, pull that loop through. Next up is a purl. So I'm going to bring my working yarn in between the 2 knitting needles to the front, go into the base of the next stitch on the left knitting needle, going from right to left, go up above towards your left hand, then down below, and push that new loop through. So I'm going to keep on alternating between the knit and the purl until 1 stitch remains. So I just worked my final purl stitch, and now for the final stitch, I'm going to bring my yarn to the back and knit that stitch. Now when I turn my work, I'm going to be working across the back side of my work, and with this row, we're going to begin slipping the first stitch. So how slipping the first stitch works is you just take your knitting needle, this one would be a purl stitch, so I'm going to go into that stitch as if I'm purling it, but instead of actually wrapping my yarn around, I'm just going to slip it from the left to right knitting needle, pretending like I worked it. After you've slipped that first stitch, the repeat begins. So now we're going to work knit 1, purl 1 all the way across. So first up is a knit 1, so make sure you now bring your yarn in between your 2 knitting needles to the back, and then start working knit 1, bring your yarn to the front, purl 1 all the way across. So knit 1, purl 1. purling that final stitch, and now I'm turning my work. So those were our 2 setup rows. Now we're going to begin the repeat. So the way the repeat works is, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the front side of my work. So this side that I currently have facing up is going to be the outside of my headband or my ear warmer. So I'm just going to pick a stitch and put my stitch marker in there. That way I remember anytime I'm looking at the side with my little pink stitch marker there, I'm working across the right side. And then when I turn my work and there's no stitch marker, I'm working across the wrong side. So now the repeat row across the right side of your work, or the front side of your work, is first we're going to slip the first stitch. So just pass it right from your left to right knitting needle. And then we're going to work purl 1, slip a stitch with the yarn and back. Purl 1, slip a stitch with the yarn and back. We're going to continue that all the way across until there's 2 stitches remaining, where we're going to purl 1, knit 1. So let me show you that repeat because there was a lot going on there. So next up, I need to purl the next stitch. So I'm going to bring my yarn to the front. I'm going to purl a stitch. And the next stitch, I need to slip it with the yarn and back. So I'm going to bring my yarn to the back of my work in between my 2 knitting needles. And now I'm just going to pass the next stitch from my right to left knitting needle as if I'm purling it. So I'm not twisting it at all. Then the repeat begins again. So I'm going to purl 1. So I bring my yarn to the front, purl 1. Next stitch, I'm going to slip it with the yarn and back. So just passing it right from my left to right knitting needle. Repeat begins again. So purl 1, pass the next stitch with the yarn and back. So I'm going to continue this all the way across until there's 2 stitches remaining. With my final 2 stitches, I'm going to purl 1, and then I'm going to bring my yarn to the back, knit 1. Now I can turn my work, and I'm going to work repeat row 2. So the way repeat row 2 works is you don't actually slip any stitches on this side. You're just going to work, slip the first stitch purlwise, then knit 1, purl 1, all the way across the rest of the row. So I'm slipping the first one purlwise, so not twisting it. Then I'm going to bring my yarn in between my 2 knitting needles to the back of my work to work the next knit stitch. So knit 1, yarn to the front, purl 1. And this should look very familiar to that second row we had worked overall. Now I turn my work and I'm back on the side where I'm looking at my stitch marker. So I'm going to work repeat row 1 again. So a couple things to keep in mind as you keep on alternating between those 2 rows is make sure you're always slipping the first stitch. What that does is, if we look at a finished one here, that creates a really nice column of stitches down either side of your ear warmer headband. So all of these down the side are my slip stitches. Another thing to keep in mind is whenever you're looking at the side with your stitch marker facing up, that'll be the side that you're working those slip stitches on. If you're on the side that doesn't have the stitch marker, that's where you're going to be either knitting or purling each individual stitch. So continue working for the length that you're going for. So for me, it's going to be 16 inches. And I'll catch back up with you to show how we cast off at that point. I've just worked for 16 inches and I'm back on the right side of my work, or the front side of my work with the stitch marker, about to work across the next row. So for this next row, we're going to cast off all the stitches. The way we do that is just a simple cast off method, because again, this cast off will be hidden. So I am going to, I'll still slip the first stitch, and then I'm going to work the next stitch in pattern. So here it's a purl stitch. So I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, purl the next stitch, And now I want to take the previous stitch on my right knitting needle, pick it up with my left knitting needle, and slide it up, over, and off the other stitch. Now the repeat begins, so I'm going to work the next stitch in pattern. So for me, it's a knit stitch. I'm not going to slip it. I'm going to knit it. Then I'm going to pass the previous stitch up, over, and off. Work the next stitch in pattern again. So bring your yarn to the front. And now take the previous stitch up, over, and off. And I'm going to continue this all the way across this edge. Now once you get to the end, you're just going to have one stitch on your right knitting needle. So you're going to pull that stitch so it becomes larger, take out your knitting needle, and now we're going to cut our yarn. And I cut my yarn so that there's about a foot left over. You can even do a little bit extra if you want to. And now I'm going to take that yarn tail and thread it through that loop. Now we're all ready to seam together to create that twist. Now the last step is going to be to seam. So my pink stitch marker broke, so I just replaced it with a green one, but currently laying on my table facing up, I have the front side of my fabric, or the right side, and going down towards the table, I have my wrong side. I also have a large tapestry needle here, so you just want to make sure the eye of your tapestry needle is large enough to hold the yarn you're using. So there's a couple different options. You can use metal ones, you can use plastic ones, whatever your preference is. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to place my pieces as I need them to begin seaming. So you want to take either side of your headband and fold it right in half. Then you want to take these two pieces and you're just going to fit them right inside of each other and get them as snug as you can in there. So that looks perfect. Now I want to take one of these two yarn tails, and I'm going to pick this one over here that was my cast off edge, and I'm going to begin seaming with this. So let me hold this in place while I thread my tapestry needle here. Reposition my little pieces here. Okay, so I'm just going to begin seaming from one side to the other and back and forth. And you want to stay close to that cast off edge and the cast on edge as you're going across, and make sure you're getting all of the layers. I'm pulling mine nice and tight too as I go across to try and reduce the size of that seam. Okay, so before I weave in my end, I'm going to look at what it looks like and make sure I like it. So I'm going to flip my headband back over to the other side and check to see what it looks like. So you can kind of play around with it a little bit and get it to lay a little bit flatter. But that looks perfect to me. So I have that nice twist. So I'm going to flip it back inside out. And now I'm going to tie these ends and weave them in. So I'll start with the one I just did. I'm going to tie a knot. Usually I actually tie double knots. So I'm going to tie a double knot on any one of the strands that's nearby. And then I'm just going to weave it again back and forth a few times through that seam that I just went through to hide that end. Once I'm all done weaving it in, I'm going to cut that yarn tail. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing for my other yarn tail, which came from my cast on edge. So I'm going to weave this one back and forth a few times. And if you didn't like how your seam looked, it's important to check it before you tie that yarn and cut it. That way you can always unweave the seam and try it one more time. Okay, so I'm going to cut it there. Flip it back inside out. Now, one final thing you can do if maybe you're gifting this to someone else and you want to make sure it looks as professional as possible is you can soak it in some lukewarm water, then gently squeeze it to get the excess water out, and roll it up in a towel also to get a lot of that excess water out, and then just lay it flat to dry. I like to just use a drying rack and just drape it over. Depending on the type of yarn you used, it may take a day or two to dry, so just keep that in mind if you're gifting it. And I'm also going to make sure I take off my stitch marker here. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below, and I'll see you next time.